Hello there, this is Steve here in Sydney of the lay hypnosis website truebluehealer.com, where in just 20 minutes you can get physical evidence of the activation of your divine spark. That will install in you. It takes a few months, but you'll get definite positive evidence, physical evidence of an internal mentoring voice with physical signals to back it up, to prove that you are not going crazy and that it's actually your intended life. That's what you're really supposed to be. And all the people who don't do this will remain sleepwalkers. That's okay. They're allowed to wake up whenever they please. Now, and I realise that you're not listening to this at all. Because I know that you're, what can I say, probably exhausted with forever fighting your way through all the mis and disinformation that comes across your screens, television and computer these days, and you have a healthy dose of cynicism, and you probably want to hang on to where you are right now because you're quite comfortable with it, and that's very, very forgivable and understandable. Got a couple of things to bring to your attention today, and I'll start right now. The burgeoning complexity of modern life it has an exhausting effect and a way of disempowering people. We just had our Australian government try to run a census on a Tuesday night, and we were all threatened. It's got to be computerised, you've got to be hunched over your computer screen ready, you're given a login, we've done all the right things, and now you have to participate. The ball's in your court, general public. So we all huddled around our screens, and I did it too, anxious to participate. And the site was closed, I discovered, closed for hours and hours and hours. And first of all, they said it was a massive cyber attack from secret Chinese hackers that closed down the website. And they were under severe cyber attack, and it was very embarrassing and red-faced. And this was a $1.5 billion computer system with its own IBM-built website and everything. $1.5 billion worth of equipment, allegedly put out of action by a denial of service attack by unknown hackers, probably Chinese villains somewhere, right? Okay? The usual political spin. It turned out a couple of days later, when the information came out in dribbles, that in fact incompetence had caused the Australian, I think it's the Signals Group, which is our version of the CIA, in control of all this equipment, didn't know what they were doing, thought they were under cyber attack mistakenly because they couldn't read screens and things, and there was a single router failure, and they thought they were under attack. So they closed the whole computer system and website down, basically stopping the census going forward and actually happening. It's an utter disgrace. But it does show how vulnerable we are to confusion or not knowing things with the burgeoning complexity of modern life. And the ABS people, the Australian Bureau of Statistics, doing the census, had the very best people. They had the best IBM programmers and all that stuff, and the best intelligence people we could muster in Australia to run the census, to maintain everyone's confidentiality. And they actually turned the website off and the computer system off to save it from these hypothesised Chinese hackers. So quite a laughing stock has been made in the newspapers of the government's attempts to modernise the censor process, the censorship process. In fact, it's making pen and paper and sending forms in an envelope look remarkably efficient by comparison. But that's just one example of burgeoning complexity, exhausting and confusing people in our daily lives today. So you could argue the internet is certainly a mixed blessing and often does more damage than good. The benefits are not outweighed by the disadvantages. I'm sure you could all tell local stories about this yourself in your private lives. And now moving to events far more serious, the genocide of the white race in Europe. Can I just do a little commentary on that? Starting off with the fact that I'll just remind you that you may not know this because you didn't learn this at school, is that probably the master of false flag attacks, false flag warfare for political outcomes, was pioneered by the British Empire. The way to defeat Indigenous independence movements is to simply commit atrocities dressed up as the perpetrators you want people to believe in. So if a local indigenous group wants to fight off the evil white man, you simply you buy a few natives dressed up in the right attire, screaming the right language and slogans, and you commit atrocities. You just pay them off. And straight away, the indigenous group is isolated. This little group of activists is isolated from mainstream society. Their own kind shuns them, okay? Now, that's been done dozens and dozens of times. You can look it up, false flags throughout history. Some of the more famous ones were, sometimes it's like a lucky break, like a free kick the ball lands right in front of you in the game of geopolitics. So in 1898, Theodore Roosevelt was the Undersecretary to the Navy, and the Secretary of the Navy was off that day. News came in that an American warship had been blown up in Havana Harbour. So on that day, where he was just filling in for the boss, Theodore Roosevelt, to become an American president soon, declared war on Spain all by himself. And that's how the Americans, this is 1898, that's how the Americans came to possess the Philippines. They made war on the helpless and crumbling Spanish Empire, you see. So you ended up with General MacArthur coming back there, having left there in disgrace, saying, "I shall return," and coming back victoriously to hand them their independence after the war, you see. So, but that's an example of a false flag attack. It was almost certainly a coal dust explosion in the boiler of the ship that blew it up in Havana Harbour. And but Theodore Roosevelt, the Undersecretary of the Navy, who was looking after the job because the senior secretary was off for the day on sick leave, he declared war on the Spanish Empire because he got the news of a single ship blowing up in a harbour. Theodore Roosevelt believed that every generation should be involved in war to keep them grounded in reality so you don't get too distanced from it in your civilised comfort. He didn't believe in too much comfort. He was a bare-knuckle boxer, and he was a firm believer. He was also a big game hunter and explorer, so he was a backwoodsman, and he grew up motherless, which tends to produce right-wing fascist-type people. But he became an American president, and he invented the famous phrase, "The only good Indian is a dead one," which sort of completed the virtual genocide of the Native American races there, you see. So that's one example of a sort of a free kick landing, the ball's landing in front of you in the game of international geopolitics, and you just take advantage of it, okay? So it's still very much a false flag operation because the Spaniards in Havana Harbour did not torpedo the ship. They didn't fire at it. Why would you sink a ship in a harbour? It's ridiculous. Why would the Spaniards take on the giant nation of the United States? It's preposterous. And there's many more cases like this. You can look up false flags on Google. There's lengthy lists of them, and you may be surprised that history is not as clear-cut as you think. The goodies and the baddies, we all like to have it nice and simple, don't we? But it's not really like that. Now, you're aware of Operation Gladio, I'm sure, where NATO had this group of people who were basically doing terrorism around Europe to scare people into the arms of the conservative governments of the day, away from communism, away from socialism. There was some fear that Italy might turn communist. Polls were indicating they would happily accept socialism. They seem to want it, you see. So a long trail of attacks took place, including the kidnapping of a former Prime Minister, Aldo Moro. So and there's a long line. You can look up Operation Gladio on Google, and it does fill in a lot of spaces that you've probably read if you've got a long life like me, over the last 50 years, you've been reading in newspapers. Suddenly it all makes a lot more sense. This is all relevant to Europe today. I'll give you a clue. Bataclan theatre weapons. I've seen editorials written on the internet that the weapons provided, some of them were traced to Kosovo. And this probably won't surprise you by now. French government has a secret intelligence wing that does false flags and coups in Africa for the usual masters, which is banks, mining companies, and geopolitical game players. Okay, so they specialise in African false flag attacks, terrorist attacks, that sort of thing. And it's believed they are involved in getting the Kosovo weapons and making them available to the Bataclan terrorists, you see. So that shouldn't surprise you by now. You can look all this stuff up on Google and find it. Now, we also noticed that Angela Merkel, who's invited all these people in to Europe, these people who can't use toilets and that sort of stuff, to come and live in Europe, and now Hollande and Merkel are attempting to get every French and a European family to take in a refugee from the third world who can't use a toilet. You should all take one in because the government refugee houses and accommodations are overflowing with people, and it's the right thing to do. And there's already been a mention of fines if you don't do it, or higher taxation if you refuse to take an African refugee or something like that. And I'm just wondering how supine the European people are going to be putting up with this. I really don't understand why Merkel is still in power. I cannot comprehend it. But we do notice that all of these attacks, and this has also been noted by Pat Condell in one of his latest rants, that all the terrorism in Europe is specifically aimed at absolutely innocent, common white people. The power pyramids have been left alone. Not one local councillor has been shot or blown up or raped. Not one top government consultant, not one member of parliament. None of the oligarchy, no rich people, no powerful industrialists. So that's been noticed. Even by Pat Condell, he's pointed this out. The totally random and bizarre street-only nature of these attacks on completely defenceless, innocent people. Nothing to do with geopolitics, nothing at all. So that's obviously a kind of organised, low-level terrorism that really doesn't make any difference, but psychologically has a great effect when you amplify it onto 4 billion plasma TV screens, etc. So that brings me to the point of this little story, that it looks to me like false flag attacks and peppering guerrilla warfare against your target group is done by the governments of the day, the French government, the German government and the UK government. They certainly allow people to do these things. They make weapons available to them. Quite often MI6 encourages these people to come from Pakistan and do things in England, that sort of thing. So it's, once again, that's really effectively state-sponsored terrorism for geopolitical gains, you see. So it looks really like almost everybody in Europe is doing terrorism to advance their own political causes. French government, German government, British government, and probably some others that we're not aware of. So, can you think of any group in Europe that's not doing terrorism? This is the salient question. Can you think of any European group that's not doing terrorism? The answer is, I'll say, spare you the agony, it's the common white people of Europe, the indigenous group of Europe. They are not doing terrorism. They're not even doing it in their own defence. It's not reported in the media anywhere, is it? You haven't seen it. Implicated in the state-sponsored terrorism, bringing in all these migrants, is the controlled press. which tries to cover up the names and identities now of the perpetrators of low-level terrorism, urban terrorism against common white European defenceless people. I've got a quote for you, I'll put it on screen in a minute, from George Soros, which reveals he is very clearly the architect of the whole thing. He says it quite openly, and it's widely available on YouTube interviews of him. He's quite open about being a Nazi sympathiser and a Nazi supporter and enjoying himself richly during World War II, confiscating goods, possessions and valuables from Jewish people. He's got a capitalist response to why he did that. He says, well, if I didn't do it, somebody else would have. I wouldn't have had a job. That's his excuse. He thinks like an investor and no one person matters much. So you may as well get some benefits coming with that position you take as confiscating goods and things, valuables from Jewish people during World War II. And he even supports Ukrainian politicians that are photographed doing Nazi salutes, you see. So he has no regrets about World War II whatsoever, about the way people were treated. So he doesn't seem to think very highly of Jewish people either. So complicit in the low-level terrorism against Europe, committed by just a tiny handful of the millions of Muslim invaders from the rest of the world, the unhappy third world, the very grievously unhappy third world. They want to invade Europe, and Sutherland, an Irish intellectual said to be father of the EU, wants to replace the white people of Europe because they're a bloody nuisance and they're not going to fit in with the New World Order, you see. So replace them with lower level, less civilised people full of belligerence and anger and ignorance with average IQs 20, 30 points lower than the nuisance white people. That's Sutherland's idea. And Soros tells you here in this quote, and I'll put it on screen for you, that it's far more visceral than that. He seems to want to, I don't know whether it's his Nazi nature or the fact that he wants to punish white people for throwing Jewish groups out of white society some 103 times in the last 1,000 years. He thinks they are worthy of punishment. But I would suspect with his nature as a jackbooted Nazi admirer that he believes punishment should be dished out all the time to anybody who, whether they need it or not, he's just that sort of a person. Sort of like a huge troll with a lot of money behind him. And he's working for English financial groups, by the way. He still works as the mouthpiece. That's all he really is. He seems to be the quintessentially evil person, but he's really only a salesman selling an English, a British Empire financial group's machinations to bring in the New World Order, where the white races are removed from the planet. They become just a memory. So that's admitted to. And I've got this quote here for you. And it just shows how visceral he is in the in his attitude toward white people. This is one chance where one place where you can say, what an incredible racist sort of thing. What kind of gratitude you've got. Because these people have invented everything that we have today, that we treasure and adore. It's just amazing. Complete lack of gratitude you often notice in people. Certainly George Soros is guilty of that, a complete lack of gratitude for the way the world is today and how it's been put together by the very hard work of many hundreds of years of white civilization. There is a point to this. I'm coming to something now, and I want to bounce an idea off you. And basically it's about the controlled media, which is owned by the same Soros groups of people, the same ethnic group that wants to punish white people for throwing Jews out of their societies 103 times. That ethnic group owns the controlled press in Europe, forever trying to hose down the news about Muslims basically being incompatible with the modern Western world because of their savagery ingrained in them by their Islamic teaching for the last 1400 years, coupled with their inbreeding and low IQ, trying to cover up their crimes against civilised Western societies, makes them complicit in the annihilation of the white race. It's not an accident all these things are happening. So, the idea I want to bounce off you is this, that the last group on earth, the innocent whites of Europe, are the only ones not doing terrorism. Can you think of, everyone else is doing it, all the power groups, all the power pyramids are doing terrorism by proxy at least. The only people not doing it seem to be the indigenous white peoples of Europe. Probably because it's beyond their comprehension that anyone could be not as nice as them. That's one of the problems of innocence that we have today. You can be a nice person and falsely believe that just about everybody else is as nice as you, because you wouldn't hurt a fly, would you? Well, that's not the case. And that's one of the downsides of being a nice person. Now, there's some good news. Mr. Hofer in Austria is likely to be elected with a resounding majority as the new president, and he'll be ushering in new, more common sense right-wing governments. He'll be able to get rid of the left-wing loonies controlling Austria. Van Bellen was a bloody idiot. He was a migrant himself, and he believed in bringing in 500 million immigrants into Austria to serve humanity's needs or something. But he's completely off his tree. But Europe's full of leaders like that, and they've got to be got rid of. And Mr. Hofer might be the first, and his election will likely reignite the Brexit thing, the Brexit vote. I don't think Lisa May is going to get away with putting it on hold indefinitely. And there's a problem for Mr. Hofer coming, and that is that although he may be elected president, and he may be able to usher in more right-wing common sense politicians to rule Austria and get them out of the EU, they're still going to be faced with a privately owned, hostile press, the mainstream media. So when you get these left-wing journalists and newspaper proprietors looking over their shoulders saying, we're going to hose it down and always make excuses for these people, it's called the racism of lower expectations, which comes out of the cultural Marxist camp. It's unbelievable that they could be so two-faced and double-standard about this. But you have lower expectations for these people. And, I mean, for example, it's even creeping into Australia. Just today, a snippet in the newspaper said the Australian Tax Office, ATO, a large organisation, has had to introduce special squat toilets for employing migrants who cannot ever bring themselves to use a Western-style toilet, for goodness sake. So we've got them in Australia now, and beginning to wonder, what else are we going to do? Are we going to bring in stoning so they feel more at home? Beheadings on every street corner so we adapt to their culture better? I mean, for goodness sake, it's the wrong way to go. Absolutely. Why should we surrender to uncivilised concepts? It's outrageous. So back in Austria, where Mr. Hofer is likely to be elected very soon, and that's going to start a right-wing push in other parties, there may be 4 or 5 other countries leave the EU and thus utterly destroy it. They are all going to be facing a very hostile press. So what's the answer to the problem of self-censoring journalists carrying out political directives of privately owned newspaper proprietors? Well, the answer is the only thing they haven't done so far, these good white European people. Terrorism. I'm afraid you're going to have to start blowing up newspaper offices when they start hiding all these crimes. Trying to sweep all these crimes under the carpet, ordering the police not to write the word rape anywhere in their notebooks, and not allowing them to write the word rape in their report computers, things like that. I'm afraid what you've got to do, this is what needs to be done. We've bent over way too far for Muslims, where they don't do anything like a cartoon of Muhammad, because it results in death threats and all that sort of stuff, and fatwas and Charlie Hebdo-style massacres, right? Well, we need some more of those perpetrated by the white people, so that left-wing journalists are equally afraid of white backlash as they are afraid of Muslim backlash, okay? I think that will give us some more balanced reporting. It's only fair to say that if it's okay, if you keep making excuses for Muslim terrorism and uncivilised Muslim behaviour, then you can make excuses for white people too, can't you, doing the same behaviour? I mean, we can't have the expectations of, the racist expectations of lower expectations, can we? That would make us all racist, wouldn't it? So, that is my suggestion, that the last people to wake up to the political usefulness of terrorism are the good, white, nice, innocent people of Europe. And I'm afraid they're going to have to add it to their repertoire for their survival as an indigenous group. And I think they are very much worthy of preservation, and we've really got to wake them up. And I don't think facing a hostile press is going to make it very easy to introduce reforms into Europe, because you're going to get two things: demonisation from the controlled press, and you're also going to get infiltration into these new parties, these common sense parties, in efforts to destabilise them, that sort of thing. Start scandals which can be amplified in hostile newspapers. Okay, so that's the. This is what I've been leading up to all through this video, and that is that I think the last people on earth to ever do terrorism are going to be the nice civilised white people of Europe, because they are so civilised, yet they have to learn it. It has to start happening to make left-wing journalists as fearful of white backlash as they are of Muslim backlash, to keep it fair, okay? So that is my suggestion in this video, and I welcome your input on this, whether you can share it. It's a pretty rude thing for me to suggest. It's very nasty, but it may be, I think it's going to be necessary as a survival mechanism. And I'll just put it on here, screen for you again, what George Soros says. He wants Europeans to be raped and murdered steadily for decades into non-existence. Okay? That's his fervent hope. He lives for that. Okay? So that's George Soros. Have I given you enough today to think about for the future? I'm just advocating copying one's enemies to survive. That's all I'm really doing here. And I'll quote the great prophet himself, who said, "I have been made victorious with terror." And truly he was. 260 million dead over 1,400 years. And that's been brought to Europe by Sutherland, the Irish academic, and Soros with his open borders organisations, okay? And all they're simply interested in is genociding every white person off the face of the earth. Okay, so the ball's back in your court. You can say something below this video. Tell me what you think. I'd love to hear.